Welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host, and today's guest is local writer Scott Sparling. Scott's debut novel, Wire to Wire, was just released by Tin House Books to rave reviews, including Publishers Weekly giving it a starred review and making it Pick of the Week. Welcome to Between the Covers, Scott Sparling.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question about the way the book is described to start out with. On the cover, it says that it's an homage to the American crime novel. And while it definitely had a lot of crime elements to me, I didn't feel like that quite did it justice. From when I was reading it, I felt like it really had primarily a sense of being an adventure or a road novel, but in a unique way mixed with a romance and the crime element. And I was curious if you considered the book to primarily be a crime book.
I never did while I was writing it. I actually like your take on it a lot better. You know, you need to be able to kind of put a label or a category on something, and an homage to a crime novel is probably as good as anything. But that I never thought of it that way as I was writing it or working on it. I thought of it as a book it is a road novel, and it's a love story between characters who are, and there's some crime involved as well. But to me, it's that story between the three main characters, Slater, Harp, and Lane, and how you resolve things when your loyalty is torn in more than one direction. The crime part of it is the plot, and that's, I think, what keeps a lot of people turning the pages.
And do you consider yourself to have specific literary influences? Do you see some predecessors either in the road novel or in the crime novel that you really were influenced by?
None in the crime novel, and I guess I'm not very well versed in that genre, but certainly in more the literary fiction world, particularly Robert Stone and the book Dog Soldiers and his first book, really, Hall of Mirrors. Those books, when I started writing, that's what I was reading, and they really blew me away. The way that he writes using very little exposition, what he does with dialogue, the fact that it's in the third person, the humor that's kind of dark humor in there, all of those things I admired, and I've probably read Dog Soldiers 6 times. I've worn out 3 copies. I'll probably wear out more. And it got so when I was writing this that I would try only to read books in the third person, which was hard to do in the past 10 years in particular when so many books are written in the first person. But so I read Robert Stone. I read a lot of Stephen Wright, who wrote Meditations in Green. Some of Doctorow's books that are written in third person. Anything really that I could find that seemed kind of in this same sound.
Well, one of your main protagonists, Slater, he has a really unusual situation going on with his health, which actually influences the way the story is told. So maybe we could start with you reading the prologue, as we discussed, and people can hear your prose and also find out a little bit about what is going on with one of the main people telling the story.
Sure, I'd be glad to. This is the beginning of Wire to Wire. The screens in Michael Slater's editing suite had immaculate reception. At night, they showed him things no one had ever filmed. Sometimes, Slater could make the images go away, but he could not keep them away. Screen 3, a 1981 Sony Studio Master, showed a freight train rolling through a dark Detroit switchyard. Silver-edged clouds hid the moon, and up ahead, invisible in the dark, a power line hung low over the tracks, hustling a current of electrons endlessly onward. Of the 2 fools standing on top of the train, one was Slater. An unlit joint bobbed between his lips. Slater and Harp had their heads down, searching their pockets for matches. The clouds were the river above. Everything else was the river below. At least, that's what Slater had been told once by a woman. It was all 99% water, she said, and there was nothing you could do to change the way any of it flowed. Standing on top of a moving freight was against all the rules that Harp and Slater always followed. Still, there they were on screen 3, perched high on a loaded woodchip car. Harp had his back to the power line. which was coming to slice off his head. And as the train began picking up speed, he found a pack of matches. "I'll light it, you light it, let me light it," Harp said. The match flared in his hand. Slater bent down slightly to meet the flame. At the last possible instant, the river above shifted. Moonlight cut through a gap in the clouds and reflected off the wire. Slater saw it coming and pushed Harp into the wood chips. He tried, in that same motion, to drop to his knees, but he was not quite fast enough. The power line kissed his forehead. It lit him up like a torch and lit the joint with 33,000 volts. But Slater never had a chance to inhale.
Well, with Slater and Harp jumping trains, and with Slater getting that injury, getting electrocuted, that really seems to open up the narrative possibilities to me for you as a writer, being able to, because he now can see things that other people aren't seeing, and reviews his life in a way that's not entirely in a linear fashion.
Yeah, it messes him up, and it does give me the, I thought that would give me the chance to kind of move some of his memories around in different places, and what I hoped to do, and I don't, it's up to each reader to see how well this works, I guess, but sometimes you'll experience an event, and while you're experiencing it, you have one take on it, but then some time passes, and you look back on it, and you think, what I was thinking was happening was only part of it, or was wrong in certain ways. And his weird memory issues, or hallucinations, if you want to call them that, at least open up the possibility that he can look back at this, because a lot of really screwed up things happen to him later in that summer when he goes back to Michigan, and so they kind of haunt him, and he does have to reevaluate them in order to get past them.
With trains being such a big theme and jumping trains, I was really impressed with how you were able to give the book such a forward momentum. And I think part of it was the fact that Slater was able to tell it in such a unique way. But there's another local writer who wrote on your book, Willie Vlautin, saying that it felt like you were when you read the book, it feels like you're in a stolen car without brakes. And that really, I thought, captured my experience of reading the book. And I was wondering if that was a conscious thing on your part to try to give it such a strong propulsion going forward. It feels like the characters, every single character feels like they're on the run from something.
Yeah. I think that was me experimenting with what made me want to keep going, and I did feel pretty sensitive all the way through it to keep the pages turning pretty fast, because it's a complicated story. Believe me, there are drafts where it gets pretty bogged down, and it was hard to know the mix between how much time should they spend on trains and how much time off. And actually, the first draft of this book, they were almost always on the trains, and what I found out was that that's incredibly limiting from a dramatic point of view. Only you're in a boxcar. Certain people, nobody can come in or come out. There's no entrances or exits. It's all dialogue. There's no props. It's just too blank of a stage. So ultimately, I had to find the right mix, or what I hope is the right mix, between the train stuff, which I think is cool. I mean, I love that stuff. But you got to get off the train and be in northern Michigan and be in some living rooms and bedrooms and bars and other places to make the story, to make a full story out of it.
Well, I know in reading about your process, and you mentioned some of your early drafts, that this book is a long time in the making. And I remember reading, correct me if I'm wrong, that at the beginning it was really a lot about trains and not very much plot. Yeah. Which is impressive that we've arrived at a book that is so tightly plotted at this point. Yeah,
I was not enamored of plot when I began. I was a much younger writer, and I thought that plot was for commercial books, and that a book about trains where you're on the road and the writing is good and the sentences are holding you might be enough, and I sent, there were versions of that got fairly good comments from agents and editors, but never quite got over the top to someone wanting to publish it. And the pushback that I would get years ago was, there needs to be a story here that people can relate to, so that all of this great stuff about trains and all that stuff can have a framework for it. And I resisted that for a good long time. I mean, I was just stubborn that I didn't. And then it's like it happens with people sometimes. Once the light bulb finally went on, and I realized I need to make this work, not just as writing but as a story. Then I really started thinking about how do I hook all these plot points together, and it was fun.
And what is your own personal experience with trains? I mean, was this something you had to research, or were you actually jumping trains yourself, like your characters?
Yeah, no, I was jumping trains. A friend of mine and I from high school started jumping trains. And first it was, grabbing a ladder ride where and I do not recommend this, by the way. I always want to give you that caveat. But this is a while ago. Trains were a little different then. We'd grab a ladder ride. We'd ride it, around the small town where we grew up, and then eventually we were in a boxcar and going to the next state. And it wasn't long after that when we discovered that you could get on a boxcar back then. I don't think this is true today, but you could get on a boxcar in someplace like St. Paul or Minneapolis on one day and be in Everett, Washington 3 days later, and just see the most amazing stuff that you would never see if you were driving or traveling any other way. And we got hooked. I mean, we would go out and take 2-week trips, month-long trips. Our biggest goal was coast to coast in Canada, from the Pacific to the Atlantic in Canada. And we made it from Vancouver, BC to Toronto. And it was taking a long, long time, and we were both out of time, but it was an amazing trip.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Portland writer Scott Sparling about his debut novel, Wire to Wire. So, Scott, you told us a lot about the trains, and you mentioned that it took a long time for you to really get your mind around the what you wanted to do as the plot hooks. So what are the things that are making Slater tick? Tell us about the story that you brought in when they're not on the trains.
Well, Michael Slater, he's had this brush with the power line, and so his vision is a little bit affected or enhanced actually by that. But he also sometimes has hallucinations. And although that's not a really big part of the story, it does come into play a little bit. He returns to the town where he grew up, small town in northern Michigan. And in the book, I mean, I love northern Michigan. I've spent a lot of time up there, and it's a really good place. It's true that for some people, it's kind of an escape. You go up to northern Michigan, you build your cabin back in the woods, and you don't have to deal with all of the stuff that we deal with in modern life in the city. And that's just one aspect. And in the real world, that's just one aspect of northern Michigan. But in the book, in the fictional northern Michigan, that's pretty much all there is. It's a place for people who are escaping reality, who are refugees from lives that haven't worked out, or who have some something they're trying to run from, or something they can't face. And so everybody that he meets, he's warned before he goes up there that everybody's got an ulterior motive behind their ulterior motive. He goes back anyway. He sees his old friend from his train hopping days and falls in love with his friend's lover. And that puts all three of them in this position of how do I be true to myself and also true to the people that are important to me? And Harp has a very specific way of dealing with that question. His the way he lives is to thyself be true. He does not compromise. And people like that, I mean, I think the world needs people like that, but they can be hard to live with on a day-to-day basis. And Harp is hard to live with. Slater is just looking for a safe place. He's what he's on the run from is everything life has thrown at him. And I thought sometimes of that Dylan song, Shelter from the Storm, because in that song, the narrative voice of that song is looking for a woman to provide shelter from the storm, and that's what Slater is doing. What he finds out is there isn't any shelter. You got to get used to the storm. You got to figure out how to survive in the storm. So when you talk about, and we started out saying it's not a crime novel. To me, yeah, it's a long way from being a crime novel. To me, it's a novel about Slater's heart there, looking for something that really doesn't exist. And then at one point he's in the car thinking to himself that he'd like to find a woman with a fearless heart, but he has the awareness that that's probably an impossible thing to find. And it is sort of. I mean, what he needs is not a woman with a fearless heart. He needs his own heart to either be fearless or less so. So he gets back to northern Michigan, and of course there's stuff going on up there. Not to give away the plot, but there are drug deals and there are crooked police, and he gets quickly kind of drawn into some of the intrigues up there, where he's in danger and his friendships are in danger.
Well, you mentioned the issue around drugs, and it seems like most of the characters in the book are at some point or another altered by drugs, whether it be the woman who the two men are both in love with, Lane, who sniffs glue, or whether it be speed or beer. And to me, the way you did that was created this excitement reading the book, because when you knew the characters were altered, you were open to the possibility they were going to do something really unexpected in the moment, which I found really heightened the moment as I was reading, because as much as I felt like I knew who the characters were, I also knew that they were also on something, so that maybe they were going to act even out of character from what I believed in it, and that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I don't know that I ever sat down with the idea that everybody would be using something, but it did trend in that direction. Lane sniffs glue, not because, and I decided on glue, and I spent a long time wondering what it was about her. I mean, because she could drink, she could do other drugs. Why glue? And then the reason that came to me is because it's such a destructive thing to do. I mean, all drugs take their toll, but it seems to me with glue, you almost have to know that you are seriously messing yourself up. And she does. And she's not doing it for pleasure. She's doing it to erase herself in some ways. And it sort of works. Slater actually, he doesn't get too, he's really not on speed until the very end of the book, but because of the way the book is told and he's remembering things all the time he's talking to us and telling us about it, he is kind of speed-addled, but he's relating all the stuff that happened, before he was given that little bottle of pills by Charlie, the Northern Michigan. Charlie is I like Charlie a lot. He's like the Northern Michigan small-town drug dealer and puppet master. He's got his hands in everything. He's got bribes. He thinks he's totally in control of this tiny town of Wolverine. And to a certain extent, he is, yeah.
Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the Bob Dylan song, Shelter from the Storm. And I guess we should mention that this takes place in the 1970s.
Right.
I don't know anything about Michigan history, but I felt like it was the end of an era, because you bring in this issue around gentrification and the building of these condos and people changing the landscape. I know it's all in the background, but it felt like maybe something was dying in the background of what was going on. Is that true to what was going on in Michigan?
Yeah, a little bit. I use the name Wolverine for this town where it's set. And I got halfway through the book, and someone pointed out there really is a Wolverine, Michigan, that it's a town of 200 people elsewhere in the state. And by that point, I didn't want to change. So I still call this fictional place Wolverine. It's really based on two real cities or towns that are right next to each other. One is Frankfort, Michigan, and one is Alberta, Michigan. And there's a bay in between them. but they're just they're practically next. They are next door, and the big ferry boats that carried entire freight trains across Lake Michigan come in and dock there, and you can just see. I don't know, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, sometime in the past, I think Alberta made the decision that they were going to be a town that had industry and marine docks and blue collar jobs and this town that's right across the bay, that made the decision. No, we're going to do tourists and boutiques and condos. And when I first started going up there wasn't that much difference between the two of them. Now, Frankfurt is a very thriving summer location, and it's a fun place to go for families and kids and everybody. But it's kind of a little bit like Cannon Beach, whereas Alberta, the town that kind of placed its bets on industry, that's actually where I like to hang out because there's nothing going on there, and it's the same. It hasn't changed, and so that's kind of you feel that stress up there. They're dependent upon the tourist economy, but it also changes. Some of it gets crowded, and people who live up there, I know I've heard some of them say some of the things that the people in the book say that the tourists we depend on them, but they also are kind of getting away from time to time.
Well, I've never been to Michigan myself, but I definitely felt like it was a character in the book that I got to know as I read it.
Yeah.
You write a little bit about how even though the book takes place in Michigan, that the Northwest played a real crucial role in bringing it to fruition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I started this book in Seattle. I was living in Seattle. I was working for Seattle City Light, the electric utility in Seattle. And I read this interview with it was an interview in Rolling Stone with Dylan, where he says, if you want to be an artist, you got to go out and find the electricity. And I'm thinking, well, I'm working with electricity every day, but clearly not the right kind. And I started taking classes. I took a class from a teacher and a writer named Jack Cady, who was later taught at Pacific Lutheran University. And Jack really got me started. I was writing about trains then, and he encouraged me to kind of keep pushing that. So I eventually left my job and spent 5 years in Seattle without a job, just picking up, the kind of freelance things that writers pick up, trying to do the first draft. I used to go back to Michigan, and my friend there, who does have a cabin out in the woods, would say, just stay. You're writing about Michigan, just stay here. Because I would go around all day writing down all these things that are in the books about how the cherry trucks would take a corner too fast, and some of the cherries would fall off the top, and you'd see them at the corner, on a dirt road that had a sharp corner. You'd see cherries on the road. All the stuff that is just kind of the detail of the book came from hanging out at my friend's northern Michigan cabin summer after summer. But I also, when he would say just stay, and I would say, all of the connection that I have to the writing community, the writing groups, first in Seattle and here in Portland, is all in the Northwest. I started working when I moved to Portland with Stephen Allred and Joanna Rose, who teach at the Pinewood Table. Totally changed my ability as a writer. There just wouldn't be a book if I hadn't spent 5 years every Thursday night in their living room around that table with a bunch of other writers. And I learned as much from the other writers as I did from the teachers. So, yeah, I think there's just a web of resources for writers here in Portland and also in Seattle that just, I don't know if it exists other places. I didn't find it other places. I had to be here to write this book.
On a totally another topic, a new phenomenon in books these days are video book trailers. And
right.
I have to say that Tin House did this fantastic job with your book trailer. It was such a joy, and I'd encourage people to seek out the Wire to Wire book trailer to watch it. Can you tell us any little piece of info about how it was as somebody who's writing all of a sudden being on screen? Because that must be kind of weird to go from writing a book and then now you're acting and you're in a trailer of sorts.
Yeah. Well, it actually the crew that did it was Tin House and then a film company called Juliet Zulu were amazing because they told me almost nothing about it. They just said, we're going to start, meet us at I think it was City Diner and we'll do it. And I get there, so I know nothing about a little bit I know about what we're going to do, but very little. And I've been involved in some filming projects before, where you film the same thing several times, 5 times, a dozen times until you get it right. They don't work that way. They just film what's there. And so it made it very easy for me. I didn't have to do anything in particular. They were willing to take whatever happened. And they made this amazing, they had some good ideas, though. We went to the freight yard, and, a train came by, and there was some freight hopping going on that, you can't script, but it happened. Someone was sent out to get some Mad Dog 2020, and so there was some of that.
It definitely felt like it did justice to the book to me.
Yeah. I when we got done with that day, I thought, man, I don't know what you're making out of this. And when I saw it later, they really did a great job with it.
So, Scott, are you working on a new project now?
I am. I'm working on 2 projects that I think will both eventually become novels, and I'm kind of just pushing them both out right now to see which one comes next. One of them is a shorter and I think a little kind of funnier book that in some ways is the inverse of Wire to Wire. In Wire to Wire, this isn't giving much away because you find this out in the first chapter. The main character, Michael Slater, has no money, but he's driving an old Ford Ranchero, which is just stuffed with drug money. Only he doesn't know it. And so, $100 bills keep fluttering out, and everybody keeps wondering where they're coming from. So that's a situation where a character actually has something that's valuable, at least in market terms, and doesn't know it. And then I just felt like turning that around to in this new book that I'm working on. The characters have something that they think is very valuable, but really don't. And the reader knows this, but they don't. And it probably would get called a crime novel. It's set in Seattle and the Northwest, and it's closer to being done. I'm also really interested in writing about. I've spent a lot of time in Detroit, and I think Detroit's a fascinating place. You read, if you just read it superficially, it's a dying city, but I don't think that's all it is. I think in some ways, what was Detroit some of that has died, but other stuff that's interesting is happening. And I also spent a little time in Phnom Penh last year. And what struck me was how much they want to be an American city. They want to speak English. They want to spend dollar bills. We've got this old American city which is struggling and going through some kind of rebirth. And then I'd spent some time in this foreign place that wants to be like an American city, and started putting together a novel that involved both of those. That one's going to take me longer because it's just more complex.
Sure. Those sound fascinating. Yeah. Well, it's great having you on Between the Covers today, Scott.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
We were talking today with Scott Sparling, the author of Wire to Wire, and if your interest was piqued, he's reading tonight at the Downtown Powell's, I believe at 7:30.